Yeah, so for those that are kind of new, this is the general slide I used to present the task. We have like these two objectives. First of all, we are here to create this forum to gather people that is busy with model development and also end users of these models related to wind conditions and wake modeling for wind farm design. And we gather all these people to build a consensus on model evaluation procedures and to establish an international verification validation framework. So far, we have 10 participating countries, and we are already in phase 3, which means that we have been running this task for quite a while, since October 2011, where we started discussing microscale models, then extending the framework to include also mesoscale models, and this last phase is kind of leveraging experiments that have been recently executed in large projects in the US and in Europe. I was also trying to put this into a more end user perspective through IC type of engagement, and trying to make also these benchmarking activities as open as possible. So this is really the general context of the task. And we do this through benchmarking. So most of the collaborative work is done through benchmarks, either for wind conditions, so where we don't have any wind farms, and that would be work package 1, which I'm leading. And then Pat Moriarty from NREL takes the benchmarking of wake models. And this has to do with single wake models, single wake type of benchmarks, so really detailed around the rotor and wake interaction, to large wind farms in the offshore environment, where we try to use industry data. We have a kind of an umbrella work package, which is work package 3, led by David Maniaci from Sandia National Labs. And here's where we put everything together into a framework, and where we also discuss maybe best practice procedures for model evaluation. But ultimately, what we deliver is this model evaluation protocol, which is an open source project, documentation project, which should include some guidelines for model evaluation, as well as access to these benchmark repositories, as well as some guidelines into what are these models about, what kind of building blocks they are developing, how to validate them with high fidelity experiments and data from industry. We also plan to do a white paper. So a white paper here is nothing but like a summary of what we are documenting in a paper format. So all of this is something I would like to kind of work with from now on until we finish this task around June next year. Oops, didn't click the right button. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, back to the presentation. We have this is the schedule we had in the proposal. It's not like we have really followed this in all the details, but essentially we have been doing these roadmaps and we used a mind map type of format, where we have all the experts kind of putting inputs into how to structure the flow models for wind and wakes, and all this has to do with the structure had to also identify what are the relevant phenomena of interest that need to be validated. And the whole point of doing this is that we should be able to identify what are the priorities for validation, or what are the gaps that we have in those models, because this is how we should approach new experiments or new R&D projects. And the whole point of doing this is to bring those national or European projects to an international context, so that the data that is generated in those projects can be leveraged to a wider community. And this is really the main focus of any IA task in general. This is the diagram we tend to use to kind of explain the scope of Task31 into different subsystems. Of course, the full system is a wind farm working in the climate, and then can divide it into different subsystems from smaller scales to bigger scales, considering the atmospheric side of things on the right, as well as the wind power side of things on the left. And the idea is to find data that allow us to validate the flow models at different scales, at different complexity levels, so that we can fill out these pyramids in all the complexities, starting with the atmospheric boundary layer in flat terrain, then moving into complex terrain. And for that, we are targeting experiments in the European Wind Atlas. And then on the turbine side, we've been busy with Swift experiments in Texas, up to the wind farm scale, where we are using data from industry, particularly from the offshore wind accelerator. Maybe more detailed measurements in connection to specific wind farms, as well as new experiments that are actually targeting very high detailed experiments near operational wind farms, like the AWAKEN experiment. And of course, we have also the interaction between turbines and terrain. And for that, we have the Perdigao experiment also coming from the new European Wind Atlas project. Yeah, not down into the turbine level, we also have the rotor community, which is present in the Task29. And we have some potential collaboration with them, although we really didn't have anything formally established. Talking about industry participation, as we see, this is like we have two IC groups that are kind of our stakeholder groups that are interested in our research, our flow models. And the idea is to extract the requirements they have for validation, so that we can really focus on that, and then define what could be quality acceptance criteria for these models. We do this also by defining high quality benchmarks that can be used to eventually certify that models can be suitable for the purposes of these IC standards. And we also use industry to leverage their data, especially when it comes to validating wake models for wind farms. These are the countries that are now involved and some of the institutions. And this is what we are busy with. We have launched kind of all the benchmarks we should kind of complete until the end of the task. And the rest of the year should be focused on moving the WIMAP documentation site to a place where we can present this at the next Expo meeting in autumn. And this should include these items here. And we want to present that in autumn because we also want to present a plan for a new task. So we have good ideas for that, because then the new task will be presented in the second quarter of next year.
So I'm here to give an update of the ALEX17 diurnal cycle benchmark. And together with Javier and Pavel, that worked in an evaluation notebook to compare the measurements of the models, we're going to give some updates on the current status of the benchmark and give a demonstration of the evaluation notebook. So just to recap, the LAE's full-scale experiment was part of the New European Wind Atlas project, and the extensive measurement campaign ran for 2 years, and it finished last year. So far, we have published a campaign and data report along with all the experimental data set that is stored in a data collection, dividing each group of instruments that can also be accessed through the DTU data portal. And all the experiment is a collaboration between DTU and CENER and the University of Baleares in Spain. The first results of the experiment is analysis of multi-scale stratified flows. And we just have prepared and submitted a paper to Wind Energy Science that hopefully will shortly be available. The experiment used many different instruments, among others, the wind scanner systems and the map masts with sonic anemometers and surface flux stations in a complex terrain area surrounding the Alaís mountain close to Pamplona in Spain. And the topography of the experiment is basically consisted of a mountain, a valley, and a ridge configuration. And what we see here in the bottom right corner is one of the scanning patterns of available LiDAR measurements that we have for this experiment. So the transect AA is actually shown on the bottom right, where we have wind scanner measurements that can be compared to the models. Looking from the top, we can see the Alaís mountain on the south, and the valley and the ridge with the location of all the measurement equipment that were deployed during the extensive measurement campaign. And one thing that we can see is that is a large-scale complex terrain with quite a different wind regime when we compare the mountaintop with the wind rows on the left with the wind regime from the valley floor in the wind rows from the right. We basically see a bidirectional wind on the top of the mountain, aligned with the north-south direction. And inside the valley, we see also other flow phenomena with valley winds prevailing from the northwest and southeast directions. During the last years, we had analyzed the LiDAR data along with the other measurements from the campaign. And we have spotted some interesting flow phenomena. In the left, we can see some wind turbine wakes of the CENER wind turbine test site that is located on the top of the Alaís mountain. So in the radial wind speed plot, we can see the wake actually being deflected from the valley winds of one of the turbines in the test site. And on the right, we can see also some RHI scans from the LiDARs in the valley, capturing some atmospheric waves. For the benchmark, the diurnal cycle benchmark, we aimed for a period that did not have such special flow phenomena in order to make it easier for the modelers to simulate one period, not having to consider atmospheric waves or considering the effect of the wind turbines. So what we have selected, it was a period with northerly winds from September 30th to October 4th, 2018. And here we just see the wind regime during this selected period on the mountaintop. On the top, we see wind speed, the middle wind direction, and temperatures measured at the mast, at the mountaintop. And this benchmark is basically directed for unsteady state models. But since we have received also many interested people with steady state models, and also to be connected with the numerical site calibration benchmark that will follow, we basically have selected periods where we can see predominantly neutral, stable, and unstable stratification, both at the mountaintop and at the valley floor. So basically, there are 2-hour periods that could be used for steady state modelers to actually have a comparison with the measurements. If we look to the LiDAR scans during neutral, stable, and unstable regimes, we basically can see that, as we said before, we don't have any special flow phenomena. During neutral conditions, what we see is really strong wind speeds, both at the mountaintop and also at the valley floor. During stable regimes, we can see a small upstream flow blockage on the upwind side of the Alais mountain. And during unstable regimes, the LiDAR scans were not fully recovery rate, but we could also spot some recirculation zones on the lee side of the ridge. Considering the quantities of interest to compare models and measurements, what we are plotting here is basically the wind speed direction, turbulence intensity, the wind shear, and the atmospheric stability. That's here. It's characterized at the valley floor with Z over L, meaning the dimensionless Bukovling. Also, on the top of the ridge and of the mountain, we have dual Doppler measurements, meaning that we can reconstruct the 2D wind speed along the plane spanned by the two LiDARs. So in the top, you can see the wind reconstruction at the north ridge, and on the south and on the bottom plot, you can see the wind reconstruction on the Alais mountain. And so this 80 points that we have, 40 on the ridge and 40 on the mountain, can also be used with the model comparison, as we will see in the notebook later. Talking about the preliminary results that we have seen in the meeting, in the previous meeting that we had, we already had analyzed some data with the downscaled WRF results. So basically taking the input, that is the WRF 3 kilometer, and comparing to the 1 kilometer WRF. And basically what we can see is that on the mountaintop, we had a really good correlation between the measurements and the simulations. Also on the windward side of the Alais mountain and on the valley center, but still the downscaled WRF lacks in the leeward side of the ridge. Also looking to wind directions, we can see that the 1 kilometer WRF in red compared to the observations in blue, it's following the observations for the mountain and the valley, but still lacks in the leeward side of the ridge. So basically, the updates for the diurnal cycle benchmark is that we have an updated benchmark guide with the periods for each stability class that were selected. And we have a model evaluation notebook that is already published in a GitHub repository. And the same notebook is also available in a cloud environment, which is part of another project, the Marinette 2, which basically aims to have a virtual research environment. And the objective here is that we can make a transparent process of the evaluation of the results, and also where each participant in the benchmark can have access to the evaluation notebook and can upload their results in a standardized way in order for us to compare the observations with the models. We can have a first look in the notebook. So basically, each participant has access to a cloud environment where we are hosting the notebook, and the notebook can be accessed and ran on the cloud. So I'm going just to open here so we can have a look. And each participant already have access. And if the results are submitted within the standards, the NetCDF format and standards that we have agreed between the participants, each simulation result is actually uploaded directly here, and we can already have a comparison. So first, we are basically loading functions in order to make the notebook as clean as possible. And we are downloading all the participants' simulations. So we could see here For example, that we have now 2 submissions. The first submission is basically the output, the worth 3 kilometer that we had seen before. And the second one is seems like a worth LES run from one of the participants. So what we basically have is that we are plotting and loading all the input data along with the output, the submissions output of each participant. As I showed before, we have dual Doppler measurements on top of the ridge and on top of the mountain. And we have RHI scans in the transect line that is 6 kilometers long, connecting the mountain and the ridge. So basically, what we are asking for the participants to do is to submit simulations along the Z transect line and also in the positions of each mast. We loading the mesoscale input data, the validation data, and the simulation data. We can basically look to some first comparisons in time series. So each participant that loaded their results in the right format can already see the performance of their simulations here. And this can be done as many times as the participant wants. As we have discussed, the shaded areas are basically the periods with specific atmospheric stabilities that were selected, focusing on steady state models, or do if one participant with unsteady models have computational constraints, he could focus on the period where we actually have both unstable, and also neutral conditions. So he could focus on the middle part of the period. Showing the quantities of interest and also some other time series where we can compare here turbulence intensity, wind shear, the stability, and heat flux for each of the observations and also for the simulations. Here we have some profiles, and as we are receiving the submissions, we can already see here in real time the comparison of each one. So this is the notebook, and Javier, Pavel, and me, we are available if anyone has any doubt regarding the uploading of the results. And to conclude, I think basically for the ALEX 17 benchmark now, we are trying to work with a timeline that is based using the Q2 of 2020 for submission of results, the Q3 to discussion of the results and start drafting a paper with the results with the participants that have submitted results. And until the end of the year, perhaps starting preparing a publication aiming for TORC 2021 or some other conference that can be discussed. So that's for me. I would like to thank for the opportunity to record this talk, and feel free to get in contact.
I'd just like to give an update on our benchmark. My name's, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Barber. I'm from the University of Applied Sciences in Rapperswil in Switzerland. We're doing a project in collaboration with this task, financed by the Swiss government. It's called Comparison Metrics Microscale Simulation Challenge for Wind Resource Assessment. I've presented this before, and all the details are on the Wind Vane blog. So I'm not going to talk about the case too much. I'm just going to kind of go over it quite quickly. Let me move to the next slide. So I'm just going to kind of remind you of the challenge or describe it if you haven't heard of it yet, and then tell you a bit about what we've changed since we launched it and which who's registered for it. So just a reminder. So we're trying to, this is kind of different from all the other challenges or the other benchmarks that you're probably familiar with. So we're trying to look at, trying to help modelers decide which tool is best for the application. So as we all know, the accuracy of wind resource assessment has a large effect on the expected rate of return of a project. The weather and wind flow is complex. Wind modeling is very challenging, as we know. There's loads of different tools available. So the person sitting there trying to decide which tool shall I use for this wind resource assessment that I've got, it's very difficult to decide this. The wrong choice can have consequences kind of in both directions. So either you do a really, really accurate, long, expensive simulation, and you don't really improve your accuracy very much, so you're wasting money, or you have a simplified model which is probably maybe too simplified for your case, and then the results are inaccurate. And in both cases, you're faced with losing money. There's not really any guidelines or tools related to this. It's kind of just left to experience or gut feeling. So we're trying to approach this. So the idea is that we develop a new decision process, which is supposed to kind of look like this. So we have something called skill score, which is basically the accuracy of the simulations plotted against the cost. And so we basically imagine, okay, the more a tool costs, the more accurate you expect it to be. But obviously at some point, this is going to flatten off. So there'll be it's kind of an apex of the curve where you can say this is probably the most appropriate solution, where adding more money doesn't actually necessarily particularly increase the accuracy or skill. And so we're trying to work out how to create plots like this to help modelers decide which tool is the best one. These red regions are just maybe the modeler has a particular definition of the skill or accuracy that they actually accept, and also obviously the cost, they probably have some sort of limit. So the goal of this simulation challenge is actually to collect comparison metrics. So comparison metrics are basically things that allow us to plot this skill and cost. We want to get as many simulations as possible. So we want to have people submitting their simulations, and we want to be able to plot these graphs. But the most important thing here is we want to be able to make this estimation before carrying out the simulation. It doesn't really help anybody if we have a nice plot like this. We've got the skill and the costs after carrying out the simulations, because the whole point is that the modeler wants to decide which tool to use before they use the tool. So we need to find a way of making estimations of these scores. And so we're trying to look at before and estimating these scores before, and then comparing them to the actual scores afterwards. So this is kind of a picture of what we expect it to look like. We've got stage 1, which is using the Perdigao site, which I'll tell you about in a second. And you kind of do your estimations before, so that each participant has got a form to fill out with estimations of skill and cost. And then there's the actual skill afterwards, so how accurate compared to the measurements are the results. And we expect to kind of see something like this, and we want to develop functions between before and after so that we can predict in advance which tool's best. We're doing a stage 1, which is Perdigao, as I said. Stage 2 is coming later, where we test cases to submit any site that they want. But I'm not talking about this today, I'm just talking about stage 1. So Perdigao, I guess some of you know this site. It's in the centre of Portugal. There are these 2 parallel ridges with southeast, northwest orientation, separated by about 1.5 kilometers, about 4 kilometers long, and 500 to 550 meters tall at the summit. The 2 main wind directions are northeast and west-southwest. There's a really, really well documented, very nice description at this website as well, so you can find out more there. And there's a very large international measurement campaign in 2017 with all these sensors here, which I won't tell you all about, but many met masts and many different measurements. And we're going to be using the 10-minute data from the 300-meter met masts and 60-meter met masts for this challenge. And they're marked on the right. So the calibration met mast is number 29, and the other ones are marked on there. The wind turbine is here. So the details of the challenge you can find on this link here. So what you actually need to do. First of all, there's a registration form which sort of provides you with the naming conventions, and you can also give confidentiality details. So if you don't have to reveal your name or the model used if you don't want. And the input mask, as I said, is mask 29. We've had to use a time period where the input mask is overlapping with the validation mask. So the time period is a little bit shortened. So we're basically from March 2017 till June 2017. The validation masks, as I said, are all these ones here. And we're still kind of hoping for SCADA data of the Enercon wind turbine, but maybe somebody can say something to that after the presentation, if this is looking likely or not. We're basically probably going to be doing the validation with the wind data, because we're not quite sure if we have this data yet. The idea is to encourage participants to carry out simulations with many different models and many different setups, because we want to try to work out how these costs and skills vary with these different setups. And we're not really focused on mesoscale forcing or nesting in this project. Just to tell you a little bit more about these comparison metrics, just so you can kind of imagine what I'm talking about. So imagine you sign up for the challenge. Before you even carry out your simulations, you have to tell us lots of information. So you have to tell us what the model set description is, and there's a Google form which allows you to enter, you know, like the grid size or the boundary conditions and everything. There's also an estimation of terrain complexity. There's some simplified questions which you're supposed to answer, and we're going to try to translate that into a metric for terrain complexity. And then you go through a separate Google form where you're estimating the skill score, and there's 26 different weighted parameters. So regarding your setup, which you give a score to, and these scores are then calculated by us into a skill score. And you do the same thing with the cost. So there's 8 different costs, like the simulation time, but also the setup time, the post-processing time, the license costs, software costs and stuff. And we've got this thing called the actual total cost. And so you actually fill out all these forms to make these estimations, and then you carry out the simulations. Afterwards, we calculate the skill score by calculating the average RMSE between simulations and measurements at the validation mask. And you have to tell us what the actual costs were of the simulations. Maybe you estimated it incorrectly. Maybe the simulations took longer than you thought. So, and after that, we produce this graph of skill score against cost score. And so just to give you an idea, you're not supposed to be seeing all these values, but about the parameters that you are asked to score. So you get questions like, what is the complexity of the aerodynamic equations? You give it a score from 0 to 100. There's things related to the model, there's things related to the input data, to the calibration method, to the energy calculations, also related to the skill of the user. And these are all then added up and weighted into an overall score skill estimation. You can see more on the website link if you're interested. And just to say, we've done this already for Bowland Hill to 6 different tools, and you can see kind of before and after here. So the before is like the estimations based on these parameters that we made for six different models, and after is what the actual accuracy was. So what you see is that the result is the same for both. So model number 2 was estimated to be the most appropriate beforehand, and then it turned out it was the most appropriate. And so the method has kind of been shown to work well, but this challenge is being done because we need more than 6 points. We need 20, 30, 40 points in order to test this method. So the results expected, we expected a skill against cost for each validation mast. We want to make an average of that for all the masts. We want to have a skill against cost for the energy calculation. We then have the RMSE wind speed compared to measurements for each mast. We have the annual energy production compared to measurements if possible, if not possible, just compared to each other. A detailed analysis of horizontal and vertical planes. We're also looking at some stochastic methods together with ETH Zurich. And then we're gonna make a Python code available on GitHub, but I guess we're gonna make a now we've seen what Pedro presented, we're gonna make a nice notebook similar to that as well. So the timeline is this challenge is open actually until the end of September. We want to have a mini symposium at WESC 2021, and then we do some more detailed analysis. Stage 2 is probably going to be delayed slightly. Yeah, so that's basically the challenge. And then the status is we made a few changes. So we've decided to define one baseline case. I mentioned at the beginning, participants are encouraged to submit many different setups, but somebody made a good point that we should have one setup which is the same, so we can actually compare the results of one setup. So there's a baseline case defined. We were using the NetCDF format for submissions, but we have got quite a few registrations from industry partners, and it seemed quite difficult with this NetCDF, so we've gone back to good old Excel. And we've also changed slightly the alignment of the vertical planes. So the website is always up to date, but the launch presentation doesn't include these changes. So please always look at the website to get the most up-to-date version. And then these are the submissions we've had. So they're not submissions. These are the registrations we've had so far. So some of the organizations don't want to be named. Some of them, most of them do. We've got a range of different tools, as you can see on this slide. We also have recorded who wants to share their results and who wants to share their comparison metrics. So, okay, one person doesn't want to share anything, which seems a bit strange, but most people want to share their results. You can kind of see there's quite a few sort of industry models on there, and there's not that many CFD models yet. So I would be really keen to get some more submissions, or to at least hear feedback from all of you if you would like to participate, and if not, why not? And then, so what I'd sort of quite like to discuss, if anybody is interested in discussing this further, how to attract more participants. We've had a few replies from people wanting to, who do LES, who don't think that this challenge is suitable for LES because of the time period that we've chosen. So I'd quite like to talk about that. Could we change it? Could we do something to get more LES involved? Should we add some measurement planes as a comparison? And then for stage 2, maybe what do people think about how do we collect results for a range of different sites? So the thing about the different sites is that we need to have one person submitting a range of different tools for one site, and the kind of what the best way might be to get this data. So I'd be happy to hear feedback or answers to those topics. Thank you.
So now we are talking about numerical site calibration. So I'm Stefan Sanquer from Meteodyn. In order to explain the attendees of the audience, what is a calibration of site? So the standard IEC, particularly the part 12.1, displaying how to measure the power performance producing turbines. So we have some reference. And the procedure is as described in my picture. So there is a mast on just close to the wind turbines, and the idea is to measure at the same time the power on the wind velocity in order to define the power curve. But when the terrain is complex, we need to define some flow correction factor in order to consider the influence of the terrain. So the Annex C defines the site calibration procedure, and in order to reduce the effect of terrains on the power performance measurements. But for that, we need to set up another mast or another remote sensor device. So it's costly and longer to define the data, and that's why some team want to do that with the numerical approach. So it's and we have to define the level of efficiency of this numerical approach. So that's why a group was defined in the IEC. This is a 12-4 part, in order to define some level of efficiency of this approach. So the name is numerical site calibration for power performance testing of wind turbines. And this technical committee met from June of on 16 to 18, the end of 18. So it's here is writing the conclusion of the group. So this is a summary. This group want to evaluate the potential application of numerical flow simulation for site calibration. And the conclusion were actually the existing open issue include recommendation for further validation, so a benchmarking test. So the team want to go to the research part of the community in order to define new recommendation and to have some benchmark to evaluate the efficiency of numerical approach for this application. So that's why we would like to go to define a benchmark for that. And at the end of the document written by IEC 12-4, there is some recommendation to define the benchmark. So there is 5 points among other, but I give you only five points. So we need for this benchmark case 2 met masts on a complex terrain. So in order to define the relation between the wind speed at the mast, so this distance will be very small. So it's maximum 2.5 diameter of the rotor. The height of the top anemometer should be equal to the hub height, almost. And all the installation should be defined in accordance with the criteria of the IEC 12.1. The test duration should be long enough in order to evaluate some variability. And if possible, we need for this benchmark test atmospheric stability measurement with differential temperature sensors. So this is the 5 main recommendation. So the International Energy Association Task31 is a good technical community for that, in order to find a benchmark test case, and in order to test the ability of numerical approach, because numerical approach is not up to no state of the art for this application. So we need to know the uncertainties, and the community is a good place to define the first guidelines for this IEC technical committee. So the ALICE experiment is should be the good candidate for that, because as you can see, this is a complex terrains, not too much complex, but complex. And there is lots of data available provided by the NIWA project. So maybe this is the candidate to go to this benchmark in order to test the numerical site calibration procedure. And as you can see, this is but it was presented before by Pedro. So we have lots of compliant masts according to the 12.1, and the period is so long, it's enough, we think. And we have data on mast very close each other. So what we can do for the numerical calculation, we have a reference mast. It's a MP5. As you can see here, MP5 is here at the beginning, at the top of the hill, and we have 3 point, 4, 5, 6, and very close to this mass. So this is very defined for the numerical side calibration because the distance is very close. So maybe this is a good candidate. And moreover, we have also other point. This is 1, 2, 3. So it's far away from this point, but maybe it's a good point also to test a numerical approach. On this case, so this is the same picture, but here, as presented before by Pedro, we have two prevalent wind directions. So it's north and south. So this is perpendicular to the ridge. So this is maybe the good effect on the wind speed. So the numerical approach can be tested in such a very highly complex situation. And the data are collected from a long period, so it's enough to have lots of wind condition. On the wind condition are the direction. So there is two main directions, but with maybe a wide sector. And also we have many stability conditions, so we can define case for different stability of the atmospheric boundary layer. So the data, the setup is very useful for that, to test the numerical approach. So the input data for this benchmark are the following. So we have a 2-meter resolution map for topography. So it's presented in this picture. So the resolution is very high. It's enough for numerical approach. We have also a 10-meter resolution map for roughness. So the roughness is the ground cover detail. So as you can see at the picture, we have some high roughness. This is a forest here, and here this is not too much. It's a very grass like this. And if we want to go further in the description of the input data, we have also 20-meter resolution map of canopy 8. It's useful because it defines the height of the trees, and we have to some of numerical approach introduce some canopy model. So this is useful data for that. And also there is other data available. This is leaf area density. So it defines the density of the canopy, and also leaf area index. So this is some model use this data. And as you can see, there is very useful information to set up the model. So other input data can be given to the candidate. We can provide wind data at reference mast, MP5, such as a mean wind speed profile and also turbulence intensity profile. So this data can be given for wind direction and stability. So the neutral, stable, and unstable. And the numerical simulation plan could be, because we have to define with a participant, we have 6 directions, so from north and south, and we can test the viability of results according to the wind direction. And the basic stability will be neutral, because we want to test first for the neutral conditions. So neutral is here, it's from slightly unstable to slightly stable. And to go further, we have optional tests. If possible, it depends on the numerical approach. We can simulate unstable and stable condition, because we have some data to compare, but it's optional. And the result delivered finally, so it is a proposal we have to define together. And so the result will be given For this parameter, this is the flow correction factor. This is the wind speed ratio between the mast, reference mast, and the other mast at the up 8. So this is almost 80 or 120 for each wind direction. And the target mast will be A1 to A6. So there is 6 points for the results and 1 point for the reference mast. So as you know, in the numerical approach, we have some steady approach, linear or runs, or unsteady approach. This is U runs or LES. And the result cannot be compared with runs because there is some unsteady wind speed. So we suggest to compare the approach with the correlation coefficient of the regression in order to deliver the flow correction factor as defined in the 12-1 standard. And other points, so we would like to compare, to go further with other comparison. Maybe we can compare the share at target mast, because this is very important in the in wind resource assessment to define the share, and maybe a flow correction factor at other aids. Moreover, we will carry out some sensitivity study by changing the stability. So we have 3 stability, and by changing also the digital elevation model resolution, because this is a parameter to that gives some uncertainties, and also we can test the sensibility of results and domain size. So the first step of our benchmark is to collect interest of the participant through a questionnaire. So with Javier, we are going to put on the blog a questionnaire in order to collect the information from participants. Many thanks for listening.
So I'm gonna go over what we did in the last year and a half or so for the Swift benchmarks. A lot of you will know what I'm talking about because a lot of you were participants in this benchmark exercise, but I'll give a quick overview for those of you who were not aware of it. So this was a multi-model validation study that considered atmospheric stratification and also wake dynamics. So I'm going to give you overview, current status. I'm going to recap the definition of the benchmark, give you just some overview of the validation results, and then some lessons learned and what we're hoping to do in the future. We have a couple publications out there. The first one was in the WAKES conference. It is the original definition of these benchmarks. They're only measurement data in there, no simulations. And then the second publication is the actual official validation study that we did under the WakeBench task. And I just approved the proofs last week for this paper, so it should be published pretty soon in the Wind Energy Journal. So it already has a DOI, so that will be coming soon. And so I wanted to acknowledge this long list of co-authors who all contributed a lot to this study.
Excuse me, Paula.
Yeah.
We are not seeing the full screen presentation. Maybe you are in a different window.
Okay, wait a second. I think it's my Mac wanted me to go into the system preferences. Let me show main screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
That's
this
working.
is what I was showing before. Yeah. Okay, so these are the 2 papers. There are a couple of online references too. We have our GitHub page that has all of the data that you need to run this benchmark case and also to do the validation study. And then there's a read the docs page where you can see more high-level information about this benchmark. These are 3 different atmospheric conditions that we considered. So a neutral, unstable, and very stable atmosphere. And we looked at statistics of the inflow, the turbine response, and the wake. So this is a benchmark exercise for idealized simulations where we're comparing statistics and not mesoscale coupled time resolved simulations. The wind turbine is a smaller turbine with a hub height of 32 meters, rotor diameter of 27, just like you see in this photo. So we developed and calibrated a open-fast model based on the measurements collected at the site. And so that's also in the GitHub full open-fast model that you can use directly or use to build your own model in a different tool. And then we have measurements of the wake with a rear-facing nacelle-mounted spinner lidar. The spinner lidar collects 984 points approximately, distributed in that rosette pattern that you're probably familiar with. We had these measurements between 2 and 5D for the neutral and stable benchmarks. And then so it takes about 30 to 42 seconds for any specific distance to be repeated again. And then for the unstable benchmark, where we wanted to focus on dynamics, we considered measurements only at 3D. So because the lidar was not cycling between different distances, it's a much faster sampling rate. So every 2 seconds we have a data set. And so this schematic here shows the data that we requested from the modeler. So these planes behind of the turbine that all of the analysis were based on. And so the proposed validation framework follows this schematic. This is a schematic from that first paper from the Wake conference. Basically, there's a calibration phase where we calibrate the model by comparing atmospheric and flow quantities. And then we calibrate the model by comparing wind turbine quantities to make sure that these things match before we even try to look at the wake. And then the second phase is a blind comparison phase where we compare the wake quantities between the models, like a model cross comparison before releasing the actual measurement data to the participants. And then in the end, the measurement data is released, and then the modelers are free to iterate on their solution and try and figure out how they can improve it. This is just an overview of the participants that we had for the study that we did last year. We had steady state models all the way to LES. The modelers were given freedom to choose a lot of things like domain size, spatial discretization, the location of the turbine in the domain, the duration of the simulation, the time step, how they wanted to prescribe the inflow, how to model the wind turbines. So some LES included the tower and the nacelle, some included only the nacelle, some did not include the nacelle. So all of those things they were free to choose. And what we found is that it was not a great idea to allow the modelers to determine how long their simulation was going to be, how coarse or how fine it was going to be. As you can see from this figure here, these are time averaged wakes for the neutral benchmark with the measurements at the very top, and then all of the different simulation approaches below that. And you can see just from these plots that the spatial resolution of the different models was quite different. So that added a lot of uncertainty in the model comparison. So in the future, I would put a hard requirement on the spatial discretization and the extent of the domain so that these things are not issues. And then we compared a lot of things in terms of wakes. I'm just going to give you guys some examples of comparisons that we did. So all of these figures are found in our wind energy paper, which, as I mentioned, will be coming out very soon. So these are one-dimensional profiles of velocity deficit at different distances downstream from 2 all the way to 5D. And then the black with the bars on it, it's the measurements, and then the different colors are the different simulation approaches. So the blues, where it says SSA in the legend, that's our steady state analytical models. And then we have some RANs in green, dynamic wake meandering type models, which here is only fast farm with 2 different kinds of inflows. That's the pinks. And then the really warm colors are the LES. And so we did comparisons like that and looked at each model individually, but also grouped them into categories. So all the steady state models together, all the LES models together. And so these bars here at the bottom are showing you how the different categories of models performed when they're bundled together like this. And so in this way, we were able to look at these mean wakes and have an idea of this overall sense of performance for the different model categories in terms of all these quantities combined: wake strength, size, recovery, expansion. And then in order to break apart the wake a little bit more, we also looked at more specific quantities like wake strength, wake recovery. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm trying to go quickly because we're so late. And then we also did dynamic wake comparisons. So this slide here is just exemplifying how on the left, the fixed frame of reference where the wake is moving all over the place, and then in the right, we have converted the exact same data to a meandering frame of reference. So the wake center is always at the point 0, 0. And so we did our analysis in both of these frames of reference to see if the wake is included in the data versus, if the meandering is included in the data versus removed from the data. What kind of information can we gain from our validation? And so if you guys want to do analysis like that of identifying the wake center and the wake edge, there's this toolbox developed by Elliot Quant from NREL. It's freely available. It's pretty easy to use. There are examples out there, and that's what I use to do these analysis. And then my last slide on examples of comparisons that we did is for the unstable benchmark. Here we have the same plots that I showed you guys before, these one-dimensional profiles of velocity deficit. But on the left, we have data with meandering, on the right without meandering. So that informed us on how much of the mismatch between the models is due to meandering. And then in the bottom, we looked at meandering alone in terms of the standard deviation of that wake center. And again, more details you'll be able to find in the wind energy paper. But basically, some lessons learned and future. We found that a lot of the underperformance in some simulation approaches was related to the atmospheric inflow. So some models had issues capturing veer or lack of veer. There were those spatial resolution issues that I mentioned. And so a solution in the future to really minimize that would be to provide the actual inflow data to participants, so everyone's starting from the exact same point. And then our results showed that for these time averaged neutral wakes, the model performance is proportional to the model fidelity. So the LES codes had better performance than the steady state codes. But these steady state models, they can be sufficient if you're only interested in simpler quantities like wake strength, and you're not so concerned with other wake characteristics like the shape and the expansion of the wake. We also found that in more challenging cases, some lower fidelity models, like lower than LES, can outperform others. So the RAN simulations that Paul Vanderland ran performed really well for the stable case, for example, where we had like very stable conditions and actually didn't have veer, and our model simulated veer. And finally, we found that a lot of the difference across the simulations comes from meandering. So we really need more dynamic wake data sets for validation. And then finally, I know that we're wrapping up this task, and we're going to focus on the WMAP for the next year. But we are working right now at NREL on this data set that we collected at this peat stable wind plant. And so this is an example of the data that we collected. We have these really good wake measurements, and we're doing validation with it right now. And so depending on what comes out of it, if it's a really clean data set, really good for validation, we hope to release that to the community so that other people can use it. We have loads measurements in the upstream and the downstream turbine. We have wake steering due to yaw. And so pending funding for next year, we might be releasing a benchmark for everyone based on these data. And that's all I have.
Yeah, so going to present on the offshore wind accelerator wake modeling challenge, which has been a project that I've been running for more than a year, with a nice participation of wake modelers, mainly dealing with engineering wake models. And these are some of the people that ended up being part of the final publication, but there's a few more that I cannot display here because of confidentiality reasons, but it was a very popular activity. Yeah, and the results will be part of the TORC conference. So what I'm going to present today is just a preliminary presentation, and you will be able to read more about it in the TORC paper. But you can already have a look at the online repositories, either at CENER, which is where we have the simulation data and the input data, and in GitHub, which is where we have the evaluation scripts, which is where you can also find some of the results that you see today. Unfortunately, I couldn't convince the operational data owners to share the validation data, so that's still a pending issue with this industry data. But still, you can of course compare with the other simulations and see where you are. These are the objectives of the challenge as they were stated in the OWA tender. So they wanted to evaluate wake models and power prediction methods with measured data, and examine the accuracy of these models, quantify uncertainty, and highlight modeling trends. And of course, we added a third objective, which is of course very much related to Task31, because we wanted to make this part of this international effort and to be able to publish the methodology in an open source manner. So this is what you can see today. So the challenge included 5 offshore wind farms. The priority was into large turbines as well as large offshore wind farm arrays. We wanted to cover also different wind climates. And when it comes to identifying what could be the physics that would be most relevant, we thought that it would be good to focus on heterogeneous inflow, how to deal with that, and also atmospheric stability. I will not list all the details of the wind farms, but here are the participating models, and you see them on the top, the ones that participated the most, and there are kind of 2 types of models here, depending on how they deal with input inflow conditions. So they either use a homogeneous inflow or heterogeneous inflow, and for them, we make available time series at every turbine, so they could use that information to kind of integrate the horizontal gradients of wind resource. So those that were using heterogeneous inflow, we put them together into an ensemble just to have a reference to compare models against. And to my surprise, many decided to adopt a time series approach. So really use the mesoscale input data and kind of use that to drive the microscale wake model. And of course, you also have the traditional mean average approach that would be just statistics, and that's it. Still, the focus is really on kind of an energy production type of objectives. So it's really the statistics, the mean average statistics that are relevant here, and not the hour-to-hour errors. So this is the model evaluation methodology in a few steps. So we provide mesoscale input data, and for that we use the European Wind Atlas WRF setup, and we add in the Fitch parameterization to include the wake effects from wind farms. The resolution that we end up providing is 3 km. So for a couple of the wind farms that have another wind farm in the vicinity, so within 3 to 5 kilometers distance. We expect not to have very good results with this input data, but we wanted to keep the same consistency across all the wind farms, and then see what would be the impact of having this lack of resolution in the results in those two wind farms. We focus on just one velocity beam from 8 to 10 meters per second, which is when you expect to see the largest wake effects. And then we just cluster the beams in terms of 30-degree wind directions and then 3 stability classes. And stability here is defined based on the C/L as simulated with the WRF data, and we use the center of the wind farm as a reference for the wind conditions definition. We use the operational data to get our validation data, and to collect the most data possible. We use a gap filling methodology that would essentially look for data points that are not close to the power curve, and then try to fill those points with a regression methodology, so a machine learning model. Still, we don't allow to have more than 10% of these gap filled data in the validation, so we don't contaminate this too much. But the idea is to have data that more or less represents what the wake models can reproduce. And we share the evaluation scripts with the modelers, so they can see what is it that we are using for the assessment, and they can also give some feedback, and they can also see how their output data works with the output figures. Something to keep in mind is wind resource gradients, horizontal wind resource gradients. Here you see how it works for the 5 wind farms, depending on the wind direction and the stability. And so what we do here is we take the simulations with mesoscale, and then we compute the gross power across the wind farm. So we compute the maximum and the minimum, and then we divide by the mean, and then we see that the variability within the wind farm is typically within 10%, but very often you see that you have 20, 30, 40, and even 50% gross power variability. And of course, this is of similar magnitude as the wake losses that you are trying to simulate with your wake model. So it's very important that you keep in mind these horizontal gradients, and you use this inside your definition of array efficiency to avoid contaminating the array efficiency prediction with this, which is kind of not something that the wake model should be predicting. So it's kind of the meso-wake framework we define, where array efficiency is defined by the net power divided by the gross power, and the power at each individual turbine can be defined based on the kind of a reference type of inflow simulation, which uses the same inflow for all the turbines, or a simulation that uses individual inflow for each turbine. So that's the difference between REF and WT here, where we include this kind of speed up effects inside the wind farm. And then when it comes to comparing models, we need to also take into account the mesoscale bias, because the inflow comes from WRF, and we know it's not the most accurate. So we can include this mesoscale correction there to have also like an inflow that is scaled according to the SCA data. But since this mesoscale correction goes both in the net production and the gross production, it's really not that important for the array efficiency. So ultimately, we can use the WRF input data, and then the wake losses will be, the array efficiency will be independent on the inflow. Something else that we need to do is to define the free stream gross power. So we need to do this for the array efficiency, the observed array efficiency. And this technique will, since we don't have meteorological observations, what we can do is to obtain this from the free stream turbines. So we can obtain the gross power from those turbines, and then kind of extrapolate those to the other turbines. So by doing this, we get a gross power that is affected by the turbine performance. So we have the actual power curve of the turbine affecting the gross power here, as well as some induction or blockage effects that are present in the front row of the wind farm. And this is nice because when you do this and you use this in the array efficiency prediction, what you're doing is to remove these effects from the array efficiency definition. So therefore you don't ask the wake models to account for blockage or for turbine performance and so on. So this is what we end up doing. So we use the same definition of gross power from simulations and from SCADA to get a fair assessment of wake losses. And the algorithm is just geometric, which is looking to whether we have a turbine in free stream conditions, and then we just interpolate those to the turbines that are inside the array. So with this, we can also define this mesoscale correction factor, which would be related to, per bin. And you can see an example here for Dagion. And you typically see around 10% in terms of this power ratio. So this power ratio is like this power. So this is typically dealing with uncertainties of, let's say, 3% meters per second. But in terms of power, it could be 10%. So yeah, this is something you can use to correct the input data. We try to see how this compares with actual meteorological observations. And for that, we have two case studies. One is west of Dublin Sands. And here you see when we compare this mesoscale correction factor from the SCADA with that from a METMAS, we see that we are pretty close. The same goes for Racebank. So these two sites are close to the Ormond and Dacian wind farms that are part of the study. You see we have a deviation which is around 1%. So this 1% is what we could attribute to this turbine performance, blockage effects, and so on. So it is maybe the takeaway here is that is kind of a small compared to the wake losses and everything else. We can also test this with the simulations, because the simulations kind of give you the true gross power, which is here in the denominator, and then you can compare with this free stream method, the numerator, and see what's the difference there. See for a wind farm like Dagian, we see that kind of 1% difference we see on the data. But we don't see that in Rosan 2, where we have wake effects from NISTED. So when we have a wind farm in the wake of another, we have longitudinal gradients of the wind resource that, of course, this method will not capture. So in those situations, you can have a bias of up to 20%. So that's something to keep in mind. But again, since this is both present in the validation data as well as in the simulation, because we should use the same method, the results should be not that dependent on this particular aspect. So we ran a blind test first, just to see whether the models would agree with each other and where is it that we find the least agreement. So here we are not using the validation data yet. We just use the ensemble as a benchmark to compare the individual simulations. And yeah, we could see that the models kind of have a good agreement. I mean, absolute error is below 3%. And when you segregate these results into stability classes, then you can see that the larger differences are when you have stable conditions, and also when you have large gradients in the wind resource. So somehow the gradients are still affecting how the models see the array efficiency. Now this is validation results. So this is simulations against observations, and you see the array efficiency on the left, then the bias, and then the mean absolute error. And we tend to see a trend towards underestimation of the array efficiency, and we believe that this is because probably the turbulence intensity that comes from the WRF model is underestimated, and this has an impact into the wave decay coefficients that the wake models use. I think this is the main effect, but we also know that there could be effects from the stringwise gradients of the gross power, and maybe a minimal effect of the turbine performance. The largest deviations are found in hormones, which is to be expected because kind of this is the situation we have, this very large cluster upstream, which is where the WRF input data is not resolved enough to kind of account for all of this. So yeah, but still is not like a very large difference. So still 5% is still okay, I would say. But of course, those were aggregated results. When you look into being results or down into the turbine level, what we see is that the errors can get to 20, 30, or even 40%. And so, yeah, what we see is that we have compensation of errors inside the wind farm and also between beams. So the engineering wake models do have kind of a decent job predicting the overall losses of the wind farm, but they have room for improvement when you want to look into individual turbines or specific wind directions or specific stability classes. And of course, this peak at zero bias is also affected by the way we define array efficiency, because we basically prescribe array efficiency equal to 1 in both observations and simulations. That's kind of how we define array efficiency. Not to focus too much on the individual results, because this could become overwhelming and we don't have the time, but this is just to give you an overview of the type of results we have in the evaluation scripts, where you can see differences in how ref or wind turbine type of input data affects the models. The models that use homogeneous inflow don't care too much about inflow corrections because it's kind of a linear scaling, but those that use heterogeneous inflow, for those you kind of simply scale the input. You would have to kind of calibrate with a wake model to get something that is kind of calibrated for the specific model. Yeah, I'll just go through this quickly because we don't really have that much time. But the idea is that I will make available the presentation, and then maybe you can just go through the specific flow cases and wind farms. We also see how in one of the cases, or one of the participants could have access to some of the input data, and then with this sensitivity test with a wave decay coefficient, we could see how this can be effectively used to calibrate the wake model. And then, for example, these two participants were using the same model from WinPro, and we could see that it's kind of a very robust tool. So you can see that they arrive to more or less the same results. This is how it works when you go for different wind directions, stabilities, and then when you look into different flow cases, Again, I'm just going quickly through this because it's too much data to really go through. Different stability classes, yeah, and all the other wind farms. And then you typically see this under prediction here of the array efficiency, which is the main tendency, and hold westernmost rough. So this is the case where we had the best agreement. Yeah, some flow cases are really good. Some others are not so good, as you could expect. Yeah, Broadside 2. So this one has, of course, all the wake effects from listed, but still the performance is still pretty good overall. Best when you have the west wind direction. Ormond is the place where you have the largest errors. Yeah, trying to wrap up here. Yeah, just trying to put all the results together. So here you see all the different wind farms stacked into this kind of summary results. So where you can see that most of the models under predict array efficiency. A few of them do the opposite, and therefore the ensemble kind of gives you the best results, if you will. That's kind of the advantage of an ensemble. You can compensate errors from one or the other. The Flores model you see here on the bottom was only using neutral conditions, and actually is a earlier version of Flores, so not the newest one. Yeah, here's some conclusions just to wrap up. So even though we focus on array efficiency, it's very important to have a good assessment of the gross power, and how to define that in array efficiency is critical. So kind of a similar conclusion as Paula said, even if you focus on wake losses, you better take care of the inflow first, so that is not affecting your assessment of the wake losses in this particular case. Especially when you have these very large horizontal gradients of the gross power. You better include that in the definition, so you can remove that. We saw this underestimation, but we think is mainly due to underestimation of turbulence intensity. Larger deviations in Ormond, so this is a call for better assessment of farm effects when you use mesoscale models, so maybe higher resolution. We see this error compensation, which gives you kind of good overall results at the wind farm level, but we see also large errors at turbine level. Yeah, you could do some mesoscale calibration, but when this is combined with the microscale, you would have to do some calibration of the two combined. That's what we found out with the analysis by TU Delft, that the calibration is not sufficient to do it just at the inflow. You would have to do it together with the wake model. And this was, of course, out of the scope of the project, so we kind of finished with this there. So that's it.
A very quick overview of what's happening in the AWAKEN project. Just a reminder, AWAKEN is a large-scale field campaign devoted to wakes and validation of wake models. Will be happening in the Central Plains of the United States. Just wanted to brief everyone here on what's been happening as of late, and invite you to participate if you're already not engaged. There is a wiki available with a lot more detail that I will focus on in this presentation. So the overall goals of the project, really, again, just to get a large data set, sets of new observations of wind farm interactions and with the atmosphere. Use those observations to validate and improve models, and And also a big part of this is we know that current instrumentation used to observe wind plant flows are insufficient, at least compared to the models that we're using to model the physics of wind plants. So we would also like to advance the state of the art of instrumentation used for observations. That's another big goal. This is a large project in the United States funded by the Department of Energy, and will be going for another 4 years or so. On the right here, by the way, is a simulation of the wind farms in the area of northern Oklahoma, where we hope to conduct that experiment. So you can see a lot of inner wind plant interactions, which is one of the physical processes that we want to study through our measurements. A little bit more detail about the different milestones and the overall timeline of the project. You can read through all of these and I will share that presentation. But basically, we hope to begin measurements about 1.5 years from now in our long-term field campaign. And those measurements will run for about 18 months. And within that measurement campaign, there'll also be a more detailed field campaign where instruments such as aircraft and things that can't be deployed for a long time will be deployed. Here's another view on the right of the site that we are focused on. So multiple wind plants interacting with each other. The blue dots are the wind turbines in the area, and the other colored dots are actually measurement locations where there have been measurements, or there continue to be measurements made from a DOE program called the Atmospheric Radiation and Measurement Program. And actually many of those sensors have been in place since the 1990s, even before the wind farms have been built. So we hope to use this instrumentation as it exists in the field and then deploy much more instrumentation in and around the wind farms. Maybe one last point on this slide. Validation studies will be the focus of the last part of the project. So we will be developing benchmarks for IEA Task31, similar to those that we've discussed in the meeting already. Some other details on what we've been doing lately. We do have a report out published by NREL that explains, again, in a lot more detail on the vision for the project and timelines and things like that. So feel free to read that if you'd like more detail. And then in this first planning year of the project, we've been working with lots of different partners, coming up with different agreements, also submitting a lot of proposals, so augmenting the amount of funding that the Department of Energy can offer and increase the overall scope of the project. And I'll show you the next slide, some of the proposals that we've already submitted and will be submitting. We do have a lot of different working groups that are active and becoming more active. One of our goals for this year is to complete the site selection by the end of September, and this means just having more formal agreements with the wind farm owners that I showed you in previous graph. And then one of the more active groups is the instrumentation development group. We did have 2 meetings in January in conjunction with 2 conferences where we talked about what are the possibilities for the next generation of instrumentation for wind energy that can be applied to the AWAKEN project and also to other wind energy applications, and where should we invest future resources in helping advance the state of the art of technology. And so one of the assignments of that instrumentation development group is to develop an instrumentation development roadmap, which will come out by the end of the year. And so if anyone is interested in helping develop that roadmap, there is still time to contribute to that. Here are the different partners outside of the Department of Energy, well, and including parts of the Department of Energy that we're working with. And each of these different agencies is offering their own funding to participate, either funding, and also many of these different agencies have their own instrumentation that they will be bringing to the AWAKEN field campaign. So it's quite a large effort already, and of course we welcome new participants for the future field campaign. And then lastly, this is my last slide. So just to emphasize again, we would love more people to participate. The working groups are becoming fairly active. So if any of these 3 working groups sounds appealing to you, by all means, we would love the help. So instrumentation development, I talked a little bit about that. They're developing a roadmap. Simulation, they're actually starting to think about designing the experiments using simulations and optimizing locations of different observational platforms within the AWAKEN experiment. And then data management, leaning on fair data management principles and trying to figure out the best way to manage the data both in real time during the experiment, but then also for long-term archival purposes. And then if people are interested in participating and have ideas for funding opportunities, we are happy to help. We've been helping with lots of different proposals, some of which I listed on the last slide. So we would welcome that. We are working up towards a potential site visit once our site selection is complete in September. We think that we will be able to go out to the site and have a look around and look at different potential instrument locations. And lastly, we do have monthly update meetings, so you're welcome to participate in those. And the best way to stay in touch with the overall project is to join our email list. And the way that you can join that is through our wiki website.
Some content, try to get through it quickly. An update on the validation roadmap that we've been working on in the ADE program through the U.S. Department of Energy, and some update on uncertainty quantification techniques for wind plan analysis. So one part of it is the V&V framework that we utilize. This is based on a lot of V&V standards, and it's published in a document from 2015. And then the application of this mainly for high fidelity models and now extending to many different models. And the summary of that work is John Naughton and I published in 2019 in what's called the Integrated Program Planning document for wind plant performance. So in that we outline going through a phenomenon identification ranking table process where you identify different phenomena that are important for the wind plant models they're trying to validate, assess those models, and then map them to different experiments in the validation hierarchy. And we map this out to wind plant physics, wind turbine physics, and mesoscale physics, and how those overlap. And the main idea of the hierarchy is that as you go up in scale and complexity, your ability to measure things decreases. So there's a balance there. And gives the case for why you need simpler experiments and even wind tunnel experiments for validation of computational models. And then we also have a framework for how to prioritize experiments. So on the left here, you can see experiments at different scale, whether they capture physics and whether the physics are present, and then a listing of the different phenomena. And again, that process is in this integrated program planning document from Jonathan and I from 2019. And then our latest report is a detailed validation roadmap for high fidelity models for wind plant applications. And this has just been published recently this year. And it goes through a list of model capabilities that we're using for wind plant high fidelity models, so specifically targeting large eddy simulations, and then lists out the different needed experiments and validation campaigns to carry those out. And a lot of that is being used to help prioritize the AWAKEN campaign that Pat just presented. So these activities tie together. And so in that planning effort, we list the different code capabilities on the left here, and then map that to the different scales of experiments here and the overlap between them in these smaller triangles. And then the mapping of those different experiments looks like this, and this is similar to the triangle that Javier presented, or the hierarchy that Javier presented earlier. So you can see, like, for the atmospheric, we go from flat terrain, neutral stability, and then go all the way up through complex terrain, and then eventually to offshore wind plants and complex terrain studies with wind farms. And AWAKEN kind of definitely fits into this upper part, where it also has wind turbines present and all their physics. And so I also wanted to cover some of the application work we're doing. So those 3 documents really summarize the validation process and give it at a high level. And then we're also applying the validation method. So building off of the work done on the SWIFT benchmark that Paula presented, we're developing more advanced metrics for validation studies, for validation work, for wakes, and also looking at including loads into those analyses, and uncertainty. So we've got some work presented at the TORC conference on the uncertainty of LiDAR measurements. And it's fundamental to how LiDAR take data, but then is applied to the spinner LiDAR from DTU that we used at SWIFT for the wake steering experiment. We're also doing a lot of work in how we use different models together for uncertainty quantification. So we started looking at how can we do uncertainty quantification of large eddy simulations of wind plants, even up to full blade resolved simulations. The answer is that we can't fully use conventional uncertainty methods like Monte Carlo sampling, because these simulations are far too expensive. And even actuator line LES for a wind plant is too expensive to do this. So we have to use a hierarchy of models together. And at Sandia, in the latest release of Dakota, some of the tools to do this are released, where you can use different fidelities of models together and different mesh resolutions together to optimize a full sampling of models. And it's just so there's a trade-off in the cost of the model and the uncertainty or accuracy of the model. And for the different models we use, so going down to OpenFast, which runs in pretty much real time, up to RLES simulations, there's about 5 orders of magnitude in computational cost between them. And so the uncertainty quantification method that we use, the multi-level, multi-fidelity method, can optimize the sampling between several levels in here. So we'll usually do 2 or 3 mesh resolutions together, so like coarse, medium, fine for LES, and then add in a simpler model like FAST or FAST Farm, or we've started using WIN2C, which is a RANS method. So we've applied this to Nalu Wind, and there's a paper from the AIAA SciTech conference showing this from last year. And we also had a paper from the ECOMIS conference from 2 years ago that demonstrates this work. And you can see that the method can show over an order of magnitude increase in the efficiency for uncertainty quantification studies, where you're doing hundreds or thousands of samples to get statistically meaningful simulations that are predictive. We're also applying this method now to some different applications. So the past study was a forward study where you take uncertain input distributions and apply them to output distributions. So we also done an inverse study just with WIN2C, so a RANS model, where we take measurements of the wake. In this case, we used high fidelity measurements from LES, but we'd like to use experimental measurements ultimately, and then find the best samples of input distributions to match those. And again, there's a lot more detail that goes into this, but I'll skip over it. And again, the really novel part of this is we can use different mesh resolutions within it. And then also we're now applying this to optimization with Snowpack, which is from MIT, and then working with the University of sorry, I can't remember the name, but another university were in Munich, Technical University of Munich, sorry. We're doing optimization studies here. So here's a simple study with 2 turbines, optimizing the placement of the study using different grid resolutions. And then also that's optimization under uncertainty, so uncertain input parameters and constraints. And And we had a session at the AWA SciTech conference in 2020 on the overlap of non-deterministic methods and uncertainty quantification and wind energy applications. And there'll be another session on that at the 2021 AWA conference with some updated progress on all these areas. We also have a few papers from the TOR conference summarizing some of those, or advances in some of this work, and offshore marine layer, atmospheric boundary layer validation as well. So thank you.
And we actually have new task guidelines from the executive committee, and they have reorganized their procedures, and based on also from some feedback they have from the IA office in Paris. And the general guideline now is that tasks cannot live forever, like standing phases one after the other. So we are not allowed to present a task extension that would kind of continue the work as we are doing now. But we are, of course, very welcome to present a new task and maintain the Wakebench community as a motivation for this new task. But the idea is that we focus on fresh ideas, and by fresh they mean think of more innovative content, so new challenges, maybe even new groups that can be invited over to, I guess they are bringing fresh ideas with themselves. Also, this could be through collaboration with other tasks, because this is something they want to encourage as much as possible. So yeah, as even though we can still keep the core aspects of the community doing benchmarking and still focus on flow models and experiments, I guess we need to find out what is it our next product or our next challenge, and make it attractive really for new people to join, and that's it. That's how they want it. We can present a task of up to 4 years, and then they allow an extra extension. So eventually we could continue this for a new task for 8 years. They also have reviewed how we present the results to the EXCO. Now they only need 1 presentation per year instead of 2, and they rather have a webinar. So a webinar is like maybe what we just did today, but thinking of a more general audience. So really not very technical, more high level, really focusing on what is the value that we provide to the general wind energy community, and what makes this task special. So this is something that we can prepare for, I don't know, before the end of the year, and maybe something we could organize maybe before the next EXCO, so that the EXCO themselves can attend the webinar, and then we have the next opportunity with them to present maybe a continuation of the task. Something they have also reorganized the whole EXCO into different vice chairs, thematic vice chairs. So we are into the wind characteristics branch, which is chaired by Stefan Barth. And you see that there are other tasks in the same branch. And we also have a committee from the EXCO that is kind of overseeing what we do, which is composed of representatives from these countries. This is nothing but a subset of the EXCO that will have a more careful supervision of what we do. And that's it. And we can, of course, ask them for some advice and so on. Stefan Barth, I think, is the best one to reach out to really ask for help when it comes to aligning the next task with what the IA EXCO wants to see. So eventually we'll have a meeting with him to have this kind of conversation. And this is what they are maybe using for kind of to understand what can be the value of our task. So how many people is engaged, of course, because we are supposed to bring a lot of people over. And then, of course, our dissemination activities are very important. We have to align with the strategic areas, but I think this is very easy. And, you know, the typical KPIs, because it is like a forum of experts, they want to see that whatever we discuss within the task is leveraged to the wider community. So we really have to make an effort into more communication, more webinars, more fact sheets, YouTube, open data. So all of that is counting towards our KPIs. So better watch for those actively. So this is what I have. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time to discuss what this new task could look like. But what we did last time was to prepare questionnaires to have inputs from as many people as possible. And maybe from that questionnaire, we can set up a discussion group to really formulate the task. And, you know, I think it's standard practice, but keeping in mind that we have to redefine the task somehow into new objectives or new challenges. In the background, we'll keep on doing the same thing, I guess, but with maybe new deliverables or new communities that are being addressed.